Bulavinaka, everyone! Today I'm going to talk a little bit about how decolonial resistance can work in both cultural research and cultural practice through engaging respectfully and proactively with Indigenous cultural protocols. Specifically, I'll touch on a Pasifika approach to dialoguing called Talanoa. I'll speak on this from the positionality of someone who is both cultural insider and cultural outsider. While I'm not an Indigenous or Italke Fijian, my mother is Fiji Indian, and I identify as a non-Indigenous Pasifika person. The complex history of Indians in Fiji is one of cultural hybridity, exchange, and tension. And while there is a degree of cultural distance in not being Italke Fijian or born in Fiji myself, there's also a sense of familiarity and kinship, as well as a deep respect for the communities who have lived and lost alongside my ancestors ever since British annexation. So, what exactly am I resisting? Well, for one thing, this. Yeah, I'm sure I don't need to tell you that this museum label is not an accurate reflection of what this Fijian object is or what it has been used for by Fijians. And yet, some variation of this name is used to describe the object in museums all around the West. It's a pretty extreme example, granted, but it's an object that makes for a good shorthand of some of the issues I want to target through my research and professional work. I've presented at several conferences about the misrepresentation and potential futures for the so-called cannibal fork. And one of the main points I like to make at these talks is that seeing an object described in this way by a museum tells us more about the collectors than it does about the community it came from. It also shows us the long shadow of epistemological violence, which is upheld by poor or inequitable relationships with communities of origin. Having good working relationships with cultural community, both outside of Australia and in the diaspora, can go a long way towards facilitating more equitable exchanges between museums and the communities they serve, as well as ensuring better representation of the diversity and cultural nuances inherent to these communities. However, when relationships are forged with these communities with a specific outcome in mind, such exchanges can very quickly become transactional. Furthermore, given the violent histories underlying Western museum collections, it may be difficult to establish the trust required to engage in better community relationships in the first place. This fraught history is by no means unique to museums, of course. The history of human research is equally culpable for fostering community mistrust, especially research carried out under Western epistemological paradigms. Human research has been used to justify slavery and colonialism, provide proof of both biological race and racial intelligence, separate identical twin and triplet children through covert adoption, permit the sterilization of ethnic minorities, the physically disabled, and the so-called feeble-minded, and provide immunity for acts of medical torture in concentration camps, to name just a few. It's partly for this reason that research ethics committees now exist, following various ethical frameworks in order to minimize the possibility of harm being committed in the name of research. It's worth keeping in mind, though, that stipulations for research ethics in tertiary institutions are, in their current incarnations, still largely incompatible with aspects of Indigenous protocols for engagement, due to the often serendipitous and spontaneous nature integral to such protocols. This makes it highly unlikely that frameworks for respectful community engagement, such as the one I'm going to talk to you about today, will pass formal research ethics processes without being seriously compromised to the point of inefficacy. I'm not going to touch on this today, but I think that this is an important point to sit with as you listen to the rest of my presentation. So now, a little bit about my specific research context. When I was approached last year to contribute PhD research to the Australian Research Council project, The Great Exhibitions and Their Lost Indigenous Objects, I knew immediately that I wanted to use the opportunity to explore not just the history of the objects I was studying, but also the potential role these objects could play for future generations of relevant global majority communities. This meant that I would need to engage with two different groups of global majority participants. Firstly, global majority cultural experts and practitioners, who I would interview to learn more about objects from their communities which were displayed at the exhibitions I'm investigating, and global majority community members in the Australian diaspora with an interest in objects from their communities, with whom I would hold focus groups in order to explore the future roles of relevant objects currently held in the collections of Museums Victoria. As a staunch activist for decolonial praxis, it was of utmost importance to me that my research methods would not be extractive. And as luck would have it, a large number of objects falling under my research scope are from the Pacific region, which means involving Pasifika cultural experts and community members among my research participants. So it made sense to me to work with non-extractive protocols for community engagement which would show respect for Pasifika community values, among others. So what exactly is Talanoa, and how does it differ from business as usual? Well, you might be surprised to learn how intuitive a lot of its principles are. At its essence, Talanoa is simply a form of conversational exchange between two or more speakers. Key values underlying Talanoa are empathy, embodiment, relationality, and reciprocity. Notions like temporality are also of little import when stories are being told, with emotional embodiment taking center stage. The process of Talanoa itself is of greater value than the outcome. Indeed, in formal settings, there's often a degree of ceremony and ritual which accompanies the dialogue. But Professor Unaisi Nambombo Mbamba probably puts it best when she frames Talanoa as an empathic apprenticeship, which is guided by rules of relationship and shared ways of knowing. What this means is that before engaging with someone, we need to put in the work to get on their level and really understand where and how they are situated culturally, in order to facilitate a fully embodied exchange and follow them in the cognitive journeys they take us on. And importantly, Talanoa is never viewed as a finite transaction, but a connection forged or reforged with an open heart. And this connection does not end once it's no longer relevant to our purposes. If the vicarious roads our conversations lead us down do not transform us in some way, we're doing something wrong. In the case of Western research, there's something to be said for how dialoguing like this might ultimately constitute a conflict of interest, or be interpreted as reflecting personal bias in your results, due to the high value Talanoa places on emotional connection. But there's still something deeply unnatural to me about our current transactional processes for participant engagement in research. And when you think about it, is it not so much more intuitive and natural for us to be engaging in relational praxis when conducting studies with human participants? Can you trust the results of your qualitative interviews, for example, when your participants have little reason to trust you? Is your research more rigorous simply because your bedside manner was cold? It seems self-explanatory that a focus on fostering a sense of genuine reciprocity over a one-off exchange of resources is more likely to establish trust early on, even if the outcomes for your research are ultimately of less concern as a result. When the relationship itself is the outcome, a research project is only the beginning. And this is important for many cultural communities because, let's face it, most research projects, no matter how much we might be aspiring towards real-world impact, tend to benefit the researchers the most. Especially when our research requires our participants to dig out painful experiences or deal with legacies of intergenerational trauma, we owe it to them to respect the process and honor the relationship itself, valuing empathy and understanding over any potential contributions to science. And again, it's worth mentioning that research funding bodies tend to put time limits on their support, as well as the permissible uses for funding, which may disincentivize researchers from investing properly in fostering right relationships with their participants prior to going through formal recruitment processes. Like I say, many fundamental aspects of these protocols are incompatible with existing ethical research paradigms. And in the Australian context, even where small interventions have been made to mitigate epistemological violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, the scope of applicability is not negotiable to other cultures. So to insist on honoring other Indigenous cultural protocols somehow, in spite of the additional work required, is in itself a form of resistance. On a more personal level, being able to engage with cultural protocols practiced in Fiji gives me as cultural diaspora a way to honor, learn about, and connect with Fijian and other Pasifika societies, while navigating what it means to respectfully coexist as a Fijian of Indian descent. To me, this is a powerful means of resisting colonial-era friction between Indian and Italke Fijians, stoked by British colonizers, which insists that we have reason to mistrust and avoid each other. It might seem like embedding such Indigenous cultural protocols into everyday practice is a pipe dream of the idealist. However, an experience I had last year not only showed me what was possible, but also what the future of museum work could look like today. At the 2024 Australian Museums and Galleries Association conference, one of the evening sessions was billed as Talanoa and Protocols, Conversations and Engagement the Pasifika Way. It was hosted by Melissa Malu and Miriama Simmons from the Australian Museum, and Simione Sevudredre from Salvaca Cultural Consultancy in Suva, Fiji. At the time, I was working at the Victoria branch of the Australian Museums and Galleries Association, and I insisted my work colleagues come with me to this session. I was so grateful they did because it absolutely exceeded my expectations of what such an event would look like. The austere colonial-style Humphrey Room of the Ballarat Mechanics Institute had its floor space covered in woven voivoi or pandanus mats, with guests invited to sit in a loose circle on the floor or on an outer circle of upright chairs. Samples of snacks typical of Fiji were lovingly distributed around the room, and in the center of it all, a large talanoa or kava bowl. After a long day of intense industry discussions, the room welcomed us with calm and goodwill. Our hosts introduced us to the process of the kava ceremony as the relaxing beverage was being prepared in the talanoa. They explained the rich history of kava drinking in the Pacific as a means of facilitating cultural diplomacy and settling disputes. Then, as we all enjoyed sipping kava from our coconut shell drinking vessels, the team gave space to chat and unwind before opening the floor to a question and answer session about the experience. Finally, when we were all well and truly relaxed and comfortable in each other's presence, Melissa and her team gifted us with songs and poetry from all around the Pacific, accompanied by the ukulele. What I bore witness to that evening at the 2024 Australian Museums and Galleries Association conference was a powerful example of an Indigenous cultural protocol being activated as a form of resistance to cultural hegemony. By insisting on a space for engaging in Talanoa with the majority white cohort of museum professionals, a group of Pasifika-identified museum professionals were able to demonstrate how it feels to lay the groundwork for trust and good working relationships with the communities we serve through Pasifika-style hospitality, openness, and exchange. One evening of embodied empathy did more work than any number of research papers demonstrating the efficacy of Indigenous cultural protocols. And within that space, I felt something shift. So there you have it. Talanoa in both research and practice. One of my biggest issues since returning to academia in 2021 has been how difficult it is to find research by people of the global majority, particularly those from so-called Global South contexts. So my last slide here is a non-exhaustive list of research about Indigenous cultural protocols by people from the relevant cultures. Hopefully these will act as a springboard to help you find similar research methods by people of the global majority which are relevant to your own discipline. Now my journey is your journey, and my Talanoa can be yours to continue. So in conclusion, to me resistance isn't just about fighting against systems that don't serve you or others. Resistance can also involve continuing to engage in nurturing practices which better serve you and your community, in spite of the dominant cultural paradigms. Talanoa is not the only Indigenous cultural protocol out there which centers relationality and reciprocity as a fundamental part of the process. Maybe we in the Australian research community would do well to take serious note of this. Vinaka Vakalevu, thanks for your attention.